Imagine buying dinner in summer heat. No fridges, no freezers, not even ice, just raw meat hanging in the heat of crowded medieval markets, swarmed by flies. Medieval people faced that daily. So how did markets keep meat safe enough to trust on the family table? Fresh meat in medieval times had a serious attitude problem. Within just a day or two without refrigeration, it would turn from dinner into a health disaster. The clock started ticking the moment an animal was slaughtered, and spoilage won more often than people like to admit. Markets during warm months became breeding grounds for trouble. Flies swarmed over meat stalls like tiny vampires, carrying dangerous germs from one piece of flesh to another. The smell alone could knock you sideways, but that wasn't even the worst part. Bacteria multiplied faster than gossip in a small village, turning what should have been nourishment into poison. Families faced a terrifying gamble every time they bought meat. One bad piece could make everyone sick, really sick. We're talking about the kind of illness that didn't just ruin your week, it could end your life. Food poisoning in medieval times wasn't something you recovered from with rest and crackers. Butchers lived under constant pressure. Sell spoiled meat, face hefty fines that could destroy their business overnight. Town authorities took food safety seriously because they understood the stakes. A butcher's reputation meant everything, and one batch of rotten meat could turn an entire community against them. The financial risk was crushing, but the moral weight was even heavier. Here's where things get interesting, though. People weren't helpless victims waiting for someone to invent the refrigerator. They developed ingenious solutions that seem almost magical when you consider the limited tools they had. Every culture, every region, every family became experts at outwitting spoilage. The medieval world operated on a completely different timeline than ours. Planning meals meant thinking weeks or months ahead. Storage wasn't just about convenience, it was survival strategy. Communities that mastered meat preservation thrived, while those that didn't struggled through harsh winters with empty bellies. But here's what makes this story fascinating. The methods they developed weren't just desperate attempts to avoid starvation. These techniques created flavors and textures that we still crave today. Bacon, ham, jerky, sausages, all of these beloved foods started as solutions to the spoilage problem. The ingenuity didn't stop at individual households either. Entire industries grew around beating bacteria to the punch. Salt merchants, smokehouse operators, and preservation specialists became essential members of every community. Their knowledge represented the difference between feast and famine. What's remarkable is how these medieval innovators turned a life-or-death challenge into an art form. They didn't just solve the problem of rotting meat, they discovered something much more valuable. The very techniques that would transform how entire civilizations ate started with understanding exactly when to act, and timing became everything. Fresh meat rotting in summer heat was a nightmare, but medieval people weren't helpless. They figured out something pretty clever. Why fight the spoilage when you could just avoid it entirely? Most animals got slaughtered in autumn, right before winter kicked in. This wasn't some random choice. Cold weather slows down bacteria like hitting the brakes on a runaway cart. When temperatures dropped, meat could hang around for days or even weeks without turning into a science experiment gone wrong. The timing made perfect sense for another reason too. Feeding animals through harsh winters was expensive and risky. Hay was precious. Grain cost money most families didn't have. Animals might not even survive until spring anyway. Better to butcher them while they were still fat from summer grazing than watch them waste away when snow covered everything. Winter months basically turned the whole outdoors into a giant refrigerator. People could hang meat in cool sheds, cellars, or even outside under-roof overhangs. The cold air did the work that ice houses would do centuries later. No fancy equipment needed, just Mother Nature doing her thing. But here's where it gets interesting. These autumn slaughters weren't grim, solitary affairs. Entire communities turned them into festivals. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families shared tools, techniques, and the massive workload. When you're processing a whole pig or cow, extra hands make everything easier. These slaughter festivals became yearly traditions that people actually looked forward to. Makes sense, right? After months of mostly vegetables and grain, fresh meat was a celebration worth having. Kids learned family recipes. Adults shared gossip and caught up on news. Everyone knew that winter was coming, but at least they'd face it with full bellies and packed storerooms. The social side mattered just as much as the practical side. Processing large animals required knowledge that got passed down through generations. Which cuts lasted longest? How thick should you slice for drying? When was meat too far gone to save? This wasn't stuff you learned from books. Smart families coordinated with their neighbors too. Your cow gets butchered this week, mine gets done next week. We share the fresh cuts that won't keep, then everyone goes home with variety instead of eating nothing but beef for months. The whole system worked because it matched human needs with natural cycles. No fighting against summer heat or winter cold. Just working with what the seasons offered. Of course, timing your slaughter perfectly was only the first step. Even in cold weather, meat wouldn't last forever without some serious help. After all that careful timing and seasonal planning, medieval people still faced a brutal reality. Fresh meat would rot fast, even in winter. That's where salt stepped in like a medieval superhero. Salt was absolutely magical for meat preservation. It pulled water straight out of the meat, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. No water meant no spoilage. Simple science, deadly effective results. But here's the thing about salt back then. It wasn't cheap table seasoning you grabbed at the corner store. Salt was precious, really precious. People called it white gold, and they weren't joking around. Wars were fought over salt mines. Trade routes existed purely to move salt from place to place. Some workers got paid in salt instead of coins, which is where we get the phrase, worth his salt. Every medieval town had specialized salt curers who knew exactly how to work this white magic. These weren't amateur butchers trying their luck. They were skilled craftsmen who understood the perfect ratios, timing, and techniques that meant the difference between preserved meat and expensive disaster. Two main methods dominated the salting world. Dry salting meant coating meat completely in coarse salt, then letting time do its work. The salt would draw out moisture day after day until the meat became leather tough and completely safe. Wet salting involved creating strong brine solutions where meat would soak for weeks, slowly transforming into something that could last months without refrigeration. The results were impressive. Properly salted pork, beef, or fish could survive entire seasons without spoiling. These weren't gourmet meals by modern standards. Salted meat was tough, salty, and required soaking before cooking, but it kept families alive when fresh food disappeared. Then there's the cultural impact that's easy to miss. Salted meats became the backbone of medieval diets during lean months. When autumn harvests ended and spring planting hadn't started, salted meat provided essential protein that kept communities functioning. Sailors relied on salted pork for ocean voyages. Armies marched on salted beef. Monasteries stockpiled salted fish for religious fasting periods. The salt curing process took real skill too. Too little salt meant spoilage and wasted food. Too much salt made meat inedible. Temperature, humidity, and timing all mattered. Master salt curers guarded their techniques carefully, passing knowledge through family lines like trade secrets. Salt worked brilliantly for preservation, but medieval people knew that relying on just one method was risky. Smart communities combined multiple preservation techniques to maximize their chances of survival. Which brings us to another crucial method that worked hand in hand with salting. Salt wasn't the only weapon in the medieval meat preservation arsenal. Drying meat became just as crucial, and honestly, way more dramatic to watch. Butchers would slice their meat into long, thin strips and hang them like laundry across wooden racks. But here's where it gets interesting. Location was everything. You couldn't just toss meat outside and hope for the best. The perfect drying spot needed constant airflow, protection from rain, and enough sunlight to work its magic without cooking the meat. Smart merchants built elaborate drying structures that looked like wooden skeletons stretching across entire market squares. These contraptions caught every breeze and maximized sun exposure. Some towns had so many drying racks that visitors said the whole place looked like giant spider webs made of meat. The process took patience. Fresh beef strips might need 2 weeks of perfect weather to transform into jerky that could last months. Fish required even more attention. Cod hung on wooden frames for so long that people called the final product stockfish, hard as wooden planks. Weather became the butcher's biggest gamble. One unexpected rainstorm could ruin weeks of work and hundreds of pounds of meat. That's why many drying operations moved indoors, with specially designed rooms featuring gaps in the walls for airflow and small windows positioned to catch morning sun. Then there's the coastal advantage. Fishing communities discovered that ocean breezes worked faster than still air. Salt spray from the sea added natural preservation while wind did the heavy lifting. Fishmongers in port towns could dry their catch in half the time it took inland butchers. But drying wasn't just about removing water, it concentrated flavors too. Properly dried meat developed intense, almost cheese-like tastes that fresh cuts never achieved. People actually preferred the concentrated flavors, especially during long winters when anything fresh was a distant memory. The weird part is how dried meat became currency in some regions. Travelers carried strips of jerky like we carry cash today. It was lightweight, nutritious, and accepted everywhere as payment for lodging or services. Quality control meant everything in the drying business. Expert meat dryers could tell by touch and smell exactly when a piece was ready. Too little drying meant spoilage within days. Too much turned meat into leather nobody could chew. Medieval people mastered this delicate balance through generations of trial and error, creating dried meats that could survive year-long sea voyages or military campaigns. But drying had one major weakness that led clever butchers to discover an even better preservation method, one that added incredible flavors while solving moisture problems completely. Ever walked past a barbecue and wondered why that smoky smell makes your mouth water? Medieval butchers figured out this secret centuries ago, but for them, it wasn't just about taste, it was about survival. Building a smokehouse wasn't rocket science. 4 walls, a roof, and plenty of hooks to hang meat from wooden beams. The real trick was keeping a steady fire burning below without actually cooking the meat. Too hot, and you'd end up with expensive charcoal. Too cool, and bacteria would throw their own little party on your precious ham. Oak, hickory, and applewood became the superstars of smoking. Each wood gave meat its own personality. Oak made everything taste rich and earthy. Hickory packed a punch that could wake up the blandest pork shoulder. Applewood? That was the gentle giant, adding sweetness without overwhelming delicate cuts. But here's where things get interesting. Smoke wasn't just flavoring. It was chemical warfare against germs. Those aromatic compounds floating through the air were actually tiny soldiers, destroying bacteria and forming a protective barrier on the meat's surface. Medieval butchers didn't know the science, but they sure knew it worked. The process took patience most people today can't imagine. Hams hung in smokehouses for weeks, sometimes months. Bacon strips dangled like leather curtains, slowly transforming from pink flesh into golden brown treasure. Sausages twisted into long chains, gathering that distinctive smoky skin that crackled between your teeth. Then there's the practical magic of keeping insects away. Flies absolutely hated smoke. While fresh meat in summer markets attracted swarms of buzzing pests, smoked meat sat peacefully in their aromatic clouds, completely unbothered. Smart butchers learned to time their smoking sessions during fly season, creating natural bug shields around their products. The smell became part of medieval town life. Walk through any market district and thick, sweet smoke would guide you straight to the butcher quarter. People associated that aroma with quality food that wouldn't kill them. Quite the selling point in an era when food poisoning was a real lottery. Smoking also solved an embarrassing problem nobody talks about. Sometimes meat started going off before butchers could sell it. Fresh spoilage smelled awful and obvious. But smoke? Smoke could mask those early warning odors, buying precious extra time. Not exactly honest, but definitely clever. The best part was durability. Properly smoked meat could travel for weeks without refrigeration, making it perfect for traders, soldiers, and anyone planning long journeys. While smoking created incredible flavors and lasting preservation, medieval cooks discovered even more clever tricks for keeping meat safe using everyday household liquids. While butchers were busy with their smokehouses, another group of food preservers had discovered something fascinating. Drop meat into acidic liquids, and bacteria basically throw up their hands in defeat. Vinegar became the hero of medieval kitchens, turning what should have been rotting meat into something that could outlast winter. The process wasn't rocket science. Fill a jar with chunks of cooked meat, pour hot vinegar over everything, and seal it tight. The acid created a hostile environment where harmful germs couldn't survive. But here's where it gets interesting. People didn't just stick to plain vinegar. Wine worked brilliantly for this job. Merchants would pack meat in barrels filled with cheap wine, creating a preservation method that doubled as a cooking ingredient. The alcohol content helped kill bacteria, while the acidity kept everything fresh. Rich families even used expensive wines, turning preservation into a luxury experience. Then there's the brine method, which sounds fancy but was really just very salty water. Think of it as salting's liquid cousin. Meat soaked in heavy brine solutions could last months without spoiling. The salt concentration had to be just right, though. Too weak and bacteria would party anyway. Too strong and the meat became inedible. Oil preservation took a different approach entirely. Completely submerging meat in oil cut off oxygen supply, suffocating the bacteria that needed air to survive. Olive oil was the premium choice, but any fat that stayed liquid worked. Some clever cooks mixed herbs into their oil, creating flavored preserves that tasted better than the original fresh meat. Honey entered the game as nature's own preservative. Its natural properties killed germs while creating an airtight seal around the meat. Egyptian techniques had proven honey could preserve things for decades, and medieval Europeans caught on quickly. The sweetness balanced out gamey flavors from older animals, too. The real genius was in combination methods. Smart preservers would salt meat lightly, then pack it in honeyed vinegar, then seal everything under a layer of oil. Multiple barriers meant multiple protection levels. Even if one method failed, the others kept working. Pickled meat became the traveler's best friend. Merchants loading up for month-long journeys packed barrels of vinegar-soaked beef and pork. Ship captains knew that pickled provisions wouldn't spoil in sea air or tropical heat. These preserved meats literally fueled medieval trade routes. But even with all these liquid solutions working perfectly, people still wanted variety in their preserved foods. The answer came from an unexpected source, turning meat into something completely different by grinding it up and stuffing it into casings. Let's talk about one of the smartest meat preservation tricks medieval people figured out, turning questionable meat into something that could last for weeks, grinding up leftover cuts, mixing them with salt and spices, then stuffing the whole mess into animal intestines. Well, that's basically how sausages were born. Not exactly glamorous, but incredibly clever. Medieval butchers realized that chopping meat into tiny pieces gave salt way more surface area to work with. Every little chunk got coated in that bacteria-fighting white gold we talked about earlier. But here's where things get interesting. They discovered that cramming this mixture into cleaned pig intestines or sheep casings created an almost airtight seal. No air meant no spoilage. Simple physics, medieval style. The real genius was in the spicing. Garlic, black pepper, fennel seeds, and whatever herbs grew locally weren't just there for flavor. These ingredients actually help mask any funky tastes from meat that was maybe a day or two past its prime. Medieval families couldn't afford to waste anything, so turning slightly questionable cuts into spiced sausages was pure economic survival. And the weird part is how long these things could hang around, literally. Sausage links would dangle from kitchen rafters or market stalls for weeks without going bad, as long as they stayed dry. The combination of salt, spices, and that protective casing created a preservation system that put some modern techniques to shame. Then there's the incredible variety that developed. Every region had its signature blend. German areas loved their heavy garlic mixtures. Italian regions experimented with wine and fennel. French territories added herbs that grew wild in their countryside. These weren't just random recipes. They were family secrets passed down through generations of butchers who'd figured out exactly which spices worked best with their local climate. Some of these medieval sausage recipes are still being used today, practically unchanged after hundreds of years. That's not nostalgia. That's proof these preservation methods actually worked. Modern salami, chorizo, and bratwurst all trace their roots back to medieval butchers who needed to keep meat safe without any refrigeration. But sausage making was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Medieval communities didn't rely on any single preservation method. They needed entire systems of rules and regulations to keep their food supply safe. The real challenge was making sure everyone followed the same standards, because one bad batch of meat could sicken an entire neighborhood. Medieval towns didn't mess around when it came to meat safety. These weren't loose guidelines. They were ironclad rules with serious teeth behind them. Butchers faced hefty fines, public shaming, or even banishment if caught selling spoiled meat. Makes sense, right? One bad batch could wipe out half the neighborhood. Market inspectors prowled the stalls like hawks. They'd sniff, poke, and examine every piece of meat before it hit the counters. Some towns required butchers to slaughter animals only on specific days, usually early morning when temperatures were coolest. Smart move considering they had zero refrigeration. But here's where things get really interesting. Every region developed their own secret weapons against spoilage, based on whatever nature threw at them. Coastal towns perfected fish preservation using sea salt and ocean breezes. Mountain villages used their naturally cool caves as giant meat lockers. Desert communities, they became masters of ultra-fast drying techniques. And the weird part is, these weren't written down in fancy cookbooks. Butcher families guarded their preservation secrets like state-classified information. A successful curing recipe could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty. Fathers passed down techniques to sons through whispered conversations and careful demonstrations. No YouTube tutorials back then. Some towns got wildly creative with their regulations. Certain German cities banned meat sales after noon during summer months. Italian markets required butchers to display their meat on marble slabs. The cold stone helped keep things fresh longer. French villages often designated specific meat days when all slaughtering happened at once, creating a community-wide preservation frenzy. Let's not forget the punishment side of things. Dishonest butchers faced more than just fines. Public pillories where townspeople could throw rotten vegetables at the offender were common. Some places forced guilty butchers to eat their own spoiled products in front of crowds. Talk about rough justice. The most successful preservation masters became local celebrities. People traveled miles just to buy their legendary smoked hams or perfectly cured sausages. These craftsmen understood something modern food scientists are still studying: how temperature, humidity, airflow, and time work together to create preservation magic. These medieval innovations weren't just survival tactics, they laid the groundwork for today's most beloved foods. Italian prosciutto, German bratwurst, Spanish chorizo, and French pâté all trace their roots back to these desperate attempts to keep meat from going bad. Those ancient butchers and their closely guarded secrets shaped the way we eat today. Their fight against spoilage gave us culinary treasures that modern technology still can't fully replicate.